So yesterday, the United States turned off all military aid to Ukraine. And then just a few hours ago, Ukrainian President Zelensky came out and said he's ready to work with President Trump to find a peaceful end to this war. Meanwhile, our European allies are putting together a coalition of the willing that could put boots on the ground to backstop any sort of peace agreement in this war. But they're actually catching some pushback from the vice president. It doesn't look like we actually want Europe to take the lead in that sense, at least. But starting with the big news that came out last night, after meeting with senior officials, a statement was made that the United States will be pausing all military aid to Ukraine. The exact statement here was, quote, from a White House official: "The president has been clear that he is focused on peace. We need our partners to be committed to that goal as well. We are pausing and reviewing our aid to ensure that it is contributing to a solution." Again, anonymous White House official there. However, there has been confirmation since then that all aid shipments have been paused. That includes not just the stuff in the United States that could be sent at some point down the road, but shipments that are currently in Poland getting ready to move into Ukraine. So across the board, everything has stopped. I should note, it sounds like intelligence sharing is still ongoing, probably training missions as well, as far as we know right now. It's just the physical goods and anything, any financial assistance as well. It seems like all of that, as of now, has been paused. Now, a couple key notes here. First off, it looks like the United States made this move without talking to or giving a heads up to any of our NATO allies. The Ramstein group here that they're talking about is a group of NATO allies that came together to talk about who is going to contribute what to Ukraine and kind of as a group determine who has this, that, or the other thing and what is the most pressing need for Ukraine today. It's been a group stood up from the early days of this war, so it looks like NATO nor the Ramstein group were given any advance notice of this move. It was actually pushed back on by kind of far-right politician Marine Le Pen in France, who historically has actually said pretty nice things about Putin and really wanted to restore ties with Russia. She said, quote, "I find the brutality of this decision reprehensible. It is very cruel to the Ukrainian soldiers who are patriotically defending their country. No one can force the United States to continue its support if it no longer wishes to do so, but it is highly questionable not to give Ukraine a reasonable amount of time to turn it around." So, and I think that's a pretty good take, all things considered. There's no chance that Europe is going to be able to backfill the U.S. Weapon shipments to Ukraine in 30, 60, or even 90 days. But this was very quick, a sudden shut off. And we are going to talk about the impact this will have on the Ukrainian battlefield, short, medium, and long term. But first, let's take a look at President Zelensky's statement that just came out shortly before this recording. And we're going to run through this piece by piece, where he says, "I would like to reiterate Ukraine's commitment to peace," saying that because he has been accused recently of not actually wanting to find an end to the war. And as someone who's followed this war from the beginning, I think that's disingenuous. This man has certainly been seeking an end to the war. He does not want the fighting to go on by all accounts. In everything he said, his stipulation is a just peace, and more on that here in a second. He said, "None of us wants an endless war. Ukraine is ready to come to the negotiating table as soon as possible to bring lasting peace closer. Nobody wants peace more than Ukrainians. My team and I stand ready to work under President Trump's strong leadership to get a peace that lasts." So you see what is really being forced here as the primary concern. We've talked about this before. It's a durable peace. You're not going to find anything in here about retaking certain Ukrainian territory. That topic, that focus of any sort of end of the war is old. That stopped being a focus probably a year and a half ago. Now, durable peace. He says, "We are ready to work fast to end the war, and the first stages could be the release of prisoners and a truce in the sky, a ban on missiles, long-range drones, bomb on energy and other civilian infrastructure, and truce in the sea immediately, if Russia will do the same. Then we want to move very fast through all the next stages to work with the United States to agree a strong final deal." That's an interesting proposal there, and I think it's probably pretty smart. What's the harm in saying, hey, how about no more long-range drone strikes for a period of time? A good faith agreement by the Russians to come to the table. And I think that's worth mentioning. The volume of those strikes is staggering. So Russian mill blogger Millinfo Live, take this with a grain of salt. It's a Russian source of Russian stats, so we need to keep that in mind. But they say in February, let's see, in February alone, 3,097 long-range drones. So these are the Shahed and Goran-style drones that are launched from Russian territory deep inside Ukraine, and then 99 missiles. So when they're talking about stopping the drone strikes, they're not talking about the small FPVs that are used at the front. These are the long-range drones that are launched against largely civilian infrastructure and civilian-focused targets deep inside of Ukraine. So 3,000 strikes in a month, it's a lot. If Ukraine is able to actually get Russia to agree to slow those down or pause those for a period of time to get these talks underway. Zelensky continues saying, quote, "We really do value how much America has done to help Ukraine maintain its sovereignty and independence. And we remember the moment when things changed when President Trump provided Ukraine with javelins. We are grateful for this. Our meeting in Washington at the White House on Friday did not go the way it was supposed to be. It is regrettable that it happened this way. It is time to make things right. We would like future cooperation and communication to be constructive. Regarding the agreement on minerals and security, Ukraine is ready to sign it at any time in any convenient format. We see this agreement as a step toward greater security and solid security guarantees, and I truly hope it will work effectively." The security guarantee portion there, again, that's what we keep coming back to time and time again. That is a major sticking point from the Ukrainian side in any negotiations to bring about an end to this war. And it's understandable from their perspective. I mean, if you look at just a map of Ukrainian territory here, this purple area, that was 2014 when old agreements didn't hold up enough for Russia to be deterred from invading Ukrainian territory. So then in 2022, they were like, listen, we didn't really get any pushback there from the international community. Let's go again. So from Ukraine's perspective, it is completely understandable that they would look at any sort of end of the war and say, without some sort of security guarantee to prevent Russia from doing this again, a ceasefire is just a temporary halt in the fighting for Russia to rearm and probably attack us again at some point in the future. Now, looking real quick at the actual impact of what these weapons shipments, the slowdown, the pause of the weapons shipments will have to Ukraine, there's a couple different sources I want to look to here, and then we're going to get back into this concept of security guarantees and what Europe is actually presenting right now. So Michael Kaufman, great analyst here, he said the suspension of U.S. assistance for Ukraine is a very unfortunate and significant development, but it may not have an immediate impact. Ukraine is far less dependent on the U.S. for day-to-day battlefield needs in 2025 than it was in earlier periods of the war. I can see the comments already popping out here screaming cope. But this is a fact. If you look at how the war is being waged day in and day out, I just came back from IDEX, tried to publish a lot of content about that major international military expo. Ukraine had a significant booth and some of the most advanced drone technology, especially in the short and long range. You know, the long-range strike-capable drones. So things that just a few days ago struck Russian oil refineries 1,300 kilometers across Ukrainian borders. That's a deep strike, further than anything we've provided them. So the Ukrainian defense industry is building quite a bit. Quantity will probably be an issue going forward, but what they're able to produce right now wasn't really on the table in any meaningful way to certainly 3 years ago. Kaufman continues by saying, Ukraine's current approach to defensive operations combines mines, strike drones, and traditional artillery fires to attrit Russian forces at 0 to 30 kilometers. Most of the casualties are now inflicted with mines and drones, which are produced in Ukraine. Traditional artillery fires are less relevant at the moment, and there is a relative parity between the two sides. In combination with munitions recently delivered by the United States in recent months, which front-loaded supplies, Europeans could sustain Ukraine through this year. However, Ukraine is likely to begin metering fire rates at this point, given the uncertainty, and therefore Russia will reestablish some degree of fire's advantage, but this is no longer decisive. At this point in the war, I think that's worth mentioning. There have been times in the war where the artillery advantage was kind of everything, especially the first summer of the war. Not right now. More and more, it's just the drones. Kaufman says the issue becomes more problematic when looking at long-range precision strikes beyond 30 kilometers. Here, systems like Gimlers, the guided multiple launch rocket system being fired out of the Mike 270 MLRS, or the HIMARS, he says these are still quite relevant, and interceptors for U.S.-provided advanced air defense systems. The impact will be pronounced over time. What he means by that is there's some degree of inventory that Ukraine is sitting on right now. So as they use those, they're going to whittle down. They're not going to be backfilled. So we might see in the short term kind of a decrease in some of those fires. But if they're not being backfilled at all, there will come a point where HIMARS fires will go to zero. Patriot interceptors could possibly go to zero, again, depending on what Europe decides to backfill with. He raises a key issue of maintenance and technical support. All this stuff breaks. All this stuff breaks when we're just using it on training exercises. It certainly breaks when it's out in the middle of a war, so it could affect their readiness. They might have the actual Bradleys, for instance, on hand, but the replacement parts, if those are now stopped at the border and not permitted to cross into Ukraine, it might be challenging for Ukraine to continue to utilize some of this equipment as they have so far. Finally, he says if this is just a halt to further shipments of munitions equipment, then the effect will be specific categories of capability. But if all forms of U.S. support are suspended, then it'll be more difficult to assess the systematic impact and follow-on ripple effects. Now, shifting over to a Ukrainian source here that's a little more gloomy. Rob Lee here posted a quote from the Financial Times that says, a senior Ukrainian intelligence official said that Ukraine would probably run out of the last American military supplies in 2 or 3 months. After that, it will be very difficult for us. It will not be a total collapse, but we will be forced to withdraw from areas more quickly. Again, going back to the map, the advantage that Ukraine has right now is they are fighting a largely defensive war. Defensive wars tend to consume less equipment, tend to consume less ammunition. So it's possible that Ukraine, they've decreased their volume of fire in a lot of different ways, and they've filled those with drones and mines, as Kaufman hit on. So with any long-term U.S. pause in military aid, I would not expect Ukraine to kick off any sort of meaningful offensive at all. They're probably going to pull back to a degree in certain areas, find the most defensible positions, and kind of ration their ammunition from there. Another solid analyst looking at this, Franz Stefan Gotti, he says, quote, here's my quick take, admittedly based on incomplete information regarding the U.S. suspension of military aid to Ukraine. 1. While not catastrophic, this decision reinforces gradual negative downward trends for the Ukrainian armed forces. 2. The immediate tactical impact will be felt in the rationing of artillery, long-range air defense ammunition, and further decreases in surface-to-surface precision strikes against targets behind the front lines. Very similar to what Kaufman was saying. 3, the effects will gradually be felt on the front line in the coming months rather than causing an immediate shock. By 2025, Ukraine is less dependent on U.S. military aid than in previous years, as indigenization of select capabilities has made admirable progress. 4, while U.S. ammunition and weapons deliveries are important, U.S. support is arguably even more critical in other areas, including intelligence. And remember, we just said a second ago, it appears as of now, U.S. intelligence sharing is continuing. Finally, he says, quote, the U.S. decision will cost more Ukrainian lives. I don't think there's any way around that. These are guys that are actively in the fight right now, day in and day out. The military equipment that we are sending over. Remember, it's not just offensive strike capabilities. We're sending a lot of medical equipment too, and jammers and air defense systems that are designed to protect, or heck, even the Bradleys, right? We always look at those as the main gun assaulting forward to take enemy positions. We've talked to a lot of Ukrainians and shared their stories here where if they had been in a Soviet-era vehicle, they would have died. But instead, they've taken 3, 4, 5, 6 drone and ATGM strikes, even running over mines, and they're still here to tell their story. So shutting off that aid, no doubt, especially in this happening so fast without any warning, will certainly cost Ukrainian lives, and that's something we need to be aware of. Now, shifting over to the Russian perspective here, we have Alexander Kotz, a Russian mill blogger, who is kind of like the least pessimistic about all of this, from a Ukrainian perspective at least. He says that even the entire stop of military aid will not deal a fatal blow to the Ukrainian armed forces. If the Americans stopped deliveries in 2023, it would mean the end of the Ukrainian armed forces. Now the main striking force, especially in defense, is attack drones, and the Ukrainians make them themselves. He says the cessation of American military supplies should, in theory, stop offensive operations or reduce them to purely tactical counterattacks. But in defense, and even without greatly saturating forward combat positions with manpower, the enemy can fight. Yes, they won't have HIMARS, ATACMS, and a large number of artillery shells. Our rear will feel calmer, and the barrel will work less often on assault detachments and consolidation groups. However, the enemy will be able to isolate the area as well as destroy our strongholds and dugouts. And this is now done by drones, which were much more effective in this component than classic artillery. So again, I think a consensus at this point across the board is this will be damaging to the Ukrainian war effort. It will not be the death knell. And I think this is something that we've struggled with here in the United States in debating the future of this war. The idea that we have some levers, and I think sometimes we overestimate and think that we have all of the levers. A complete shutoff of U.S. military aid will not result in Ukraine stopping the fight right now. Now, shifting over to the security guarantees and the peace deals and where this might actually go, interestingly enough, Financial Times came out with this article just a few hours before Zelensky said, Actually, let's get back to talking. And it talks to what they refer to as President Trump's ceasefire trap. I don't know that I would necessarily go that far, but I think it does point to the concerns that Zelensky has here. It's back to those security guarantees. Whether or not you think Ukraine has the appropriate negotiating position or not, I think we should all probably be able to agree that this is a rational ask. Whether or not it's actually going to end up being agreed upon is maybe a different story. But in this article, they say Zelensky has balked at the idea of a quick ceasefire, haunted like many Ukrainians by the period after 2014 when Moscow frequently flouted the terms of an armistice and political settlement. Brokered by France and Germany, the so-called Minsk agreements of 2014 and 15 were aimed at putting an end to the conflict in Ukraine's eastern Donbas region, where Moscow-backed separatists were backed by Russian troops. Quote, "We don't need any Minsk agreement," Zelensky said on Sunday at the end of a flying visit to the UK. Quote, "It is a trap." I think that's kind of where the trap phrasing came in this article. But he said, quote, or moving over to Trump, he said, quote, "I don't want to talk about security yet because I want to get the deal done. Security is so easy. That's about 2% of the problem. I'm not worried about security. I'm worried about getting the deal done." And Zelensky then quoted former U.S. President Ronald Reagan saying, quote, "Peace is not just the absence of war." Again, looking at Ukraine's recent history, they have seen these deals on paper that have not materialized. And right now, the way that this one is written, the mineral deal that they're getting ready to sign, it's a between-the-lines understanding. And Vice President Vance is going to talk about that here in a minute. But they say much of French President Macron's conversation with Trump at the White House last week revolved around the need for a durable ceasefire before a peace settlement, according to a senior French official, so we can avoid in some way history repeating itself. That meant that the Russians, quote, "making commitments that can be verified, measured, and in the case they are broken, can be met with a robust response from the European and their American allies." Again, a durable peace, like security guarantees of some shape or form. They say there's a strange mix, looking at the current agreement that's been put forward by the Trump administration, between a ceasefire and a settlement agreement, said Thomas Grimminger, a Swiss diplomat and former head of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He said that was very unfortunate. There was no clarity in terms of implementation. There was no clear sequencing. He said there was no clarity in the lines of contact between the two sides and no fully fledged disengagement zone to keep forces apart. And crucially, there was no accountability for violations. So again, going back to some of Zelensky's statements here, the most important thing, what he's hammering on here a couple different times, a peace deal that lasts. And then right here at the end, we see this agreement, the one he's getting ready to sign, as a step towards greater security and solid security guarantees. So what we're seeing take form in that sense is actually Europe stepping up a little bit, and they held a kind of an emergency security conference this weekend after the big mix-up between Zelensky, Trump, and Vance in the White House on Friday. And what they came together with was a couple loose ideas, I think is the best way to put it. A plan of a plan is, I think, how I heard someone refer to it as, and that's pretty accurate here. They floated that they would, Britain and France would lead the negotiation to end the war, looking for a 1-month ceasefire, talking about air, land, and sea in that ceasefire. And they suggested the idea of putting somewhere less than 30,000, maybe 20 or 30,000 total troops on the ground to backstop some sort of peace agreement. That's kind of what they're looking at. And more on that here in a second, but I do think it's worth showing. Just last night, American Vice President Vance kind of commented on that and pushed back on this idea that Europe might be taking lead in some of these negotiations. So let's go ahead and play that here, and we'll talk to it.
When you would talk to the Biden administration officials in private, this is another example of a terrible situation the Biden admin left the Trump administration. When you ask them what's the plan, okay, we're going to spend tens of billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars in Ukraine. What is your plan? And they would honestly tell you, well, we're just going to send them weapons for as long as we can and hope eventually they can turn the tide. Hope is not a strategy. Throwing money and ammunition at a terrible conflict, that is not a strategy. The only guy in town with a strategy is the President of the United States, and everybody needs to follow his lead.
What scares me is Zelensky, when he says it's going to go on for years, how many more lives are going to be lost? He's not going to have a country to save at the end of that.
Personal gripe here. I don't like it when other people project onto other countries this feeling that we care more about their people than they do. I find it hard to believe that any American politician cares more about Ukrainians than the Ukrainians themselves. And you can apply that in any direction. Other people looking at us and vice versa. I just feels very performative, if you will.
Minerals deal would have provided the monies to rebuild their country and a strong U.S. presence and maybe European troops as well.
And this is an important part of it. The president knows that, look, if you want real security guarantees, if you want to actually ensure that Vladimir Putin does not invade Ukraine again, the very best security guarantee is to give Americans economic upside in the future of Ukraine. That is a way better security guarantee.
Counterpoint, the best security guarantee is an actual security guarantee and not having to read between the lines and interpretation of what economic cooperation might look like. I get that stance from Vice President Vance and the Trump administration, but again, looking at this from Ukraine's perspective, they have seen agreement after agreement fall through and not actually be meaningful in any way, shape, or form. So if they're looking at this, I think the last thing they want for a meaningful security guarantee is for it to be on a just trust us basis, not actually written down in the agreement. Back up a little bit here so we don't miss this next part.
That is a way better security guarantee than 20,000 troops from some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years. The security guarantee and also the economic guarantee for Ukraine is to rebuild the country and ensure that America has a long-term interest. You're not going to do that if you come to the Oval Office, insult the president, and refuse to follow his plan for peace.
Okay, so Vance caught a lot of heat pretty quickly for talking about 20 or 30,000 troops from a country, the random country that hasn't won a war in 30 years. So again, remember the context of this. He did not say France and he did not say the UK. However, within the last 24 hours, it's been France and the UK floating that number out there to, in their words, provide a deterrence force to backstop any sort of peace deal in Ukraine. So people are kind of coming down hard on Vance, kind of understandably so in that sense. I would like to say that in Afghanistan, I did have the opportunity to fight alongside our British brothers in arms. It was the Royal Engineers. They drove into Taliban-controlled territory with an armored engineering vehicle and plowed a road for us during Operation Dragon Strike in 2010, taking small arms fire the whole way. They made a road so we didn't have to walk over IEDs, and there was nobody else in the country at that point that had the equipment to do what they did. So positive experience that I had with our British brothers in arms that certainly were fighting a war at some point in the last few years here. But that's what I'm getting at when I'm saying there's this pushback against Europe starting to take point. So this is where I feel like we're getting mixed signals in some sense. I see a lot of people arguing that the issue with Ukraine is that we just don't want to be the ones in charge. It's Europe's problem. Europe needs to take control here. They need to take more responsibility for their defense. And in recent days, we've seen a lot of talk about that happening, to be fair, like it's going to take a while to get to action. But it seems like as Europe talks about doing that, it upsets people in the United States, if that makes sense. Almost like we wanted to talk it, but when they start taking action, it's like, no, that's not what we meant. We still want to have influence over events on the European continent, or maybe even in Ukraine with Russia. So the most recent iteration, I would say the biggest step for Europe at this point was this coalition of the willing session that they had this past weekend. They called it, immediately after Zelensky left the White House on Friday, and there were 19 different heads of state from across Europe that came to this meeting. And there were a couple key points that came out of this that we hit on a minute ago. But a big one here is after a ceasefire is brokered, Ukrainian troops would be responsible for policing what could be an 800-mile-long buffer zone. And behind the Ukrainians would sit this reassurance force made up of fewer than 30,000 troops committed by European countries and Canada. The challenge right now that we're getting out of this entire agreement is it's not clear. First off, it's a plan of a plan. Remember, there's nothing concrete. It's not clear what countries are really on board. It sounds like the UK and France, certainly. But after that, it's a little more questionable as to how many are actually on board with this plan or putting troops on the ground specifically. And of course, the bigger question being, can they do it? Can these European militaries really increase defense spending in a way that would be a deterrent to further Russian aggression? Now, before wrapping up here, I want to give you all an idea of kind of American sentiment on some of these issues right now. Polls are a tricky beast because I feel like people either love them or hate them, depending on if they agree with their preconceived notions, if you will. But this is one that just came out of CBS News. I think they had the numbers here. I think it was around 1,600 Americans that were polled for this one. But there are a couple that I wanted to highlight. Right here at the top, 51% say that the United States should continue to send weapons and military aid to Ukraine. So more say yes than no, but that number has decreased quite a bit. I want to say towards the start of the war, it was in the 70 percentile. For the majority of the conflict, it's been in the 60s. So this is the closest that it's been to a split decision. However, there still are more Americans in favor of that. In the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which side do you personally support? 52% for Ukraine, only 4% for Russia, which I believe in this poll, given the number of questions, that's actually like within the margin of error. And then interestingly, 44% kind of sitting on the sidelines saying neither. They just aren't paying attention, aren't interested, or something else entirely. They say, or last one here, regarding the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, do you think Donald Trump's actions and statements have favored Ukraine, favored Russia, or treated them equally? Only 11% think that Trump has favored Ukraine so far in these negotiations, whereas 46% believe that he has favored Russia, and 43% have treated them equally. Now, the reason I wanted to bring this up is because the American sentiment right now is things like we want to continue working with our allies. In fact, let me go up a little bit and see if these are right here. 78% of Americans want to stay in NATO. 67% of Americans say that we should continue working alongside our allies instead of not getting involved overseas. So most Americans want to stay in NATO, work with our allies. They support Ukraine. They, by a narrow margin, support sending weapons to Ukraine. And they think that Trump's actions have aligned more with Russia than Ukraine. So it's this weird mix, and it's hard to get a grasp of exactly what's happening regarding this conflict from a U.S. perspective, because a lot of the actions and the statements we're seeing don't exactly line up with what I would say are the general American consensus. But it does seem like there's movement right now. Again, Zelensky wanting to come back to the negotiating table. And at the same time, it looks like Europe is taking pretty strong steps in standing up their own internal defense industry, or improving it, I should say. They, of course, have their own defense industrial base and might be moving towards some sort of European army, if you will, which probably isn't the worst of ideas, given how the last few weeks have gone between the United States and a lot of our friends. But that's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.